I want to read a passage from Isaiah 61, and this may be a passage you've read before, you've heard before. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting for the Lord, for the display of his splendour. They will rebuild ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. Strangers will shepherd your flocks. Foreigners will work your fields and vineyards, and you will be called priests of the Lord. You will be named ministers of God. You will feed on the wealth of nations, and in their riches you will boast. Instead of shame, you will receive a double portion. Instead of disgrace, you will rejoice in your inheritance, and you will inherit a double portion in your land, and everlasting joy will be yours. For I, the Lord, love justice. Now, this was an old scripture. It was written by Isaiah, a prophet. It was talking about something God was going to do in bringing his people out of captivity. And yet when we jump into the New Testament, the second half of the Bible, we find Jesus standing in a temple and reading from the scripture, as if he is saying, I am the person that is being spoken about here too. This is not just a statement of something God has done. This is a statement of something God is going to do. And we are looking at this now today, looking back and saying, God, you did it, and you did it again in Jesus. What an incredible scripture to read about the change that God might bring. What can be swapped out? What it seems is broken can be restored and rebuilt. And I want to talk about poverty today. I want to talk about what we've just read. What does it mean to be good news to the poor? And I want to start by telling almost the conclusion of my talk, and then to go back over it. You know, if you've ever read a book, do you ever sometimes you sort of get into the story and you want to just read the last chapter, just to see if you could find out what happens at the end? Well, it's going to be a bit like that today. I want to give almost a conclusion. So if you listen for the first few minutes, you'll kind of know where I'm going with this, but I hope you will stick with it and just see not just that what we understand that we've read, but how we have a part to play and what it means for us where we live today. Let me start by saying this: poverty is an injustice. Nelson Mandela in London in 2005 said this: overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity, it's an act of justice. It's the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and a decent life. You know, if justice is that which is right, if it's those circumstances being as they should be, then poverty in all its forms must be an injustice. It isn't right, and it should never be. And what I mean by that is, I don't think it was ever part of God's intended design. If you go right back to the beginning of the Bible, poverty wasn't present. It wasn't there at the point of creation. When God looked and he declared over everything he had made and he said, it's very good, poverty was not present. At that point, there was no lack of provision. All there was an all-sufficient God and a creation invited to depend on him, to receive from his all-sufficient supply. And it's described as good. It was good then. It remains good today. He never changes. But we read how Adam disobeyed God, and that design was spoiled. Immediately we see Adam feeling that he lacks something. He says he's naked. We find that he fears something. He moves away from God, who he is created to depend on. And instead of the role that he's given, this responsibility, this authority in the earth, we find he hides away. And yet God still seeks him out. Adam, where are you? Why? Because he's a God of justice. He's the God who puts things right again, the God who comes to restore. Poverty is an injustice. God is a God of justice. So what does that mean about how we think about poverty today in all its forms? I think it means three things. First, I think it means that poverty is not simply a social or political issue that we need to address. It's a spiritual issue. Governments alone can never fix poverty. And I'm not discounting what governments can do and do. I spent the majority of my working life working for central government. Political will and decisions dramatically changes lives of ordinary people for the better. I've seen how that can happen. I'll never forget the result of a church-led campaign many years ago in 1998, the Jubilee Campaign. It was a campaign that was seeing if $100 billion or pounds of unmanageable debt from the poorest countries could be written off. And in the run-up to that year, there was a huge campaign, a huge mobilisation of ordinary people in ordinary churches up and down this country, petitioning the government. And it was listened to. And a British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown at that time, came up with an initiative that could see debt being cancelled for the poorest countries. And he led a campaign across governments to see if global governments would be part of this and see debts written off. And it happened. And in 1998, I was in Birmingham. I was at the G8 summit in that building where the documents were signed that made that agreement. And yet all around Birmingham, I had friends, people who were part of churches, created a human prayer chain around that city, praying that something would change that day. And it did. That day, political will changed. People made decisions. I think something else happened. I think God moved that day. He's a God of justice. He's a God who puts things right. So I don't discount what governments can do, but there's a spiritual side of poverty too. Secondly, if it is a spiritual issue, it means that Jesus and his cross have something to say into poverty. We find a response to poverty in that. There's a scripture that says God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all things at all times, you may have all that you need, so you can abound in every good work. It's a scripture in 2 Corinthians, and it talks about generosity, but it expands grace being not just a work of salvation for you, but this impacts everything in our lives. His grace to us, all that we receive because of Jesus, everything. It speaks into issues of lack and poverty. And finally, if it's a spiritual issue, and if Jesus has made a way that addresses poverty and lack, then for you and me as followers of Jesus, we have something to do and something to speak into poverty in our time and place. So that's what I want to speak about today, the calling on each one of us to be good news to the poor. But what do we understand by poverty? What do you think of when you hear that word? You probably think, first of all, it's somebody who has no money. It's somebody who is financially poor. You may have an image of somebody who has no food. They have no water. They're going hungry. Maybe there's a lack of health provision. Maybe you picture an economically poor country, a lack of education, no work, low paid work. Poverty exists in the poorest countries and the richest countries, in different levels, in different contexts. But I think the feeling is the same. And it's probably summed up as powerless. That there is nothing I can do to change my situation at this time. I have a lack and there is nothing I can do about it at this moment. I'm reliant or dependent on other people, on charity, whatever it might be. And so there's a number of aspects of poverty I want to talk about today. And there is a possibility that each of us may in our life have experienced one of these, or maybe even now, today, feeling that we are experiencing that now. I believe there's a message of good news today for each of us to receive, but also one that we can share. And maybe we have stories ourselves of how we have received grace, and we have a story to tell. I'd love to hear your story. It may be that today prompts you to realise something that God has done. You may not fully understand all of it, but you just know that you used to feel like that, and now you feel like this, and maybe God has been at work in your life. I'd love to hear your story. In 1 Corinthians it says this: we can see and understand only a little. Sometimes we don't see that full picture. We can understand only a little about God. As if we were looking into a poor reflection in a mirror. One day we're going to see him completely, face to face. Now it's a little hazy, maybe blurred, but we will see everything clearly, just as clearly as God sees. And until then, there's these three things: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. You know, we can't understand everything about God, but here's three things, three pillars, if you like, that we can begin to build our lives from. Three things that help us see God clearly. And as a church, you know, we build around these three things. That's why on our website, on banners when we meet together, you'll see those three things. Knowing God, it's about faith. Loving people, it's about love. It's this moment where almost faith and community collide, impacting our world, how we see hope restored. And so maybe poverty, as we can look at it today, is the absence of those three things. A loss of hope, where there may be what we could call aspirational poverty, that sense of lack, hopelessness. Maybe a loss of community, social poverty. And maybe a loss of just meaning in life, spiritual poverty. Things that we've read earlier, robbed from that creation, robbed in Adam, and yet can be restored in Jesus. Let me just talk a little bit about aspirational poverty. You know, I grew up, my personal story, in a place called Mansfield in Nottinghamshire, born in the 1960s. And it's in the middle of England, and it's the area called the Midlands. And there were two main industries in that area. Everybody worked in that, and it was either coal or steel. And everyone who I knew, all my friends at school, all their parents worked in those industries, and all my family worked for the National Coal Board. A state-owned industry. It ran the mines, and my grandfather and all my uncles worked in the coal mines, and my father worked for the coal board. And if I had any aspiration, or if my family had an aspiration for me, it would be that one day I would get a job in the pit. As a miner, maybe. Maybe it could be in an office if I did better. Maybe I could be a planner or a surveyor. But I remember being told that when I reached the age of 14, I would be able to go into the pit. I would be able to go down that lift shaft and see what it was like. It wasn't a bad aspiration to have. It was what everyone else had. It was what everyone else did, and they were well-paid jobs in that area at that time. You know, through a number of circumstances, the death of my father and my mum remarrying, we moved away in the 1970s. Over the next 10 years, all the Nottinghamshire pits closed following a government decision. It was decided it was no longer economically viable to operate those pits, and everyone lost their jobs. And they lost that hope, and there was no longer an aspiration. I remember going back to visit relatives during that time. I remember the miners' strike, and you can find clips of this and news articles from the day. I remember seeing devastated communities. I remember seeing broken families, fathers and sons and brothers arguing. And it impacted my family, where one uncle would be working and another would be on the picket lines trying to prevent people going in to work. There was no money. There was no hope of changing the government's mind. There was no hope for children and the next generations. Lives that have been affected with that need rebuilding. They need confidence restored. Hope needs to be rebuilt. You know, Adam in this garden situation, by disobedience, breaks his relationship with God. The God who says, I've given you all that you will ever need. And Adam says, I'm lacking something. I'm naked. Robbed of his provision. distanced from his provider. Something has been lost. I wonder how you feel right now when you think of aspirational poverty and hope. I wonder whether your circumstances are that there's a lack. It feels like the money each month never quite matches all the bills. And every time you hear someone say from the front in a church or on a tape or in a song that God is your provider, it's like you grit your teeth because it doesn't feel right now like he's yours. And so let's be honest about where we find ourselves this morning. This is a human condition. Why not take a moment and take that thought, that lack, that shortage, that debt, and say, I'm feeling that right now, but I'm hearing a word that says something different, that somehow in Jesus, you have an answer to this. Allow God to speak to you today into that situation as you hold whatever it is you might be feeling right now before him. You know, Jesus in his human experience knew something of not having things. Imagine his upbringing, born to a teenage mother in a barn. I think the sweet Christmas card scenes don't quite do justice to what that might really have been like. You know, Luke 9, Jesus has a conversation with a man, and one of the responses Jesus has is that he has no place to lay his head. There are things he doesn't have in his human condition at that time. He's saying to this man, when you begin to follow Jesus, when you follow me, you need to change some of the way that you view things. There's something that happens in the way we see things. You know, the second kind of poverty is social poverty, this loss of community. We're created as social beings. We need each other. I think the biggest challenge that we've all faced over the last 2 years has been to do with social distancing, not being able to meet up with those we want to. As a church, it's a massive challenge. You know, we meet every week and suddenly we're told you cannot meet in that way. However hard we try with doing things online and being as creative as we can with church gatherings, we cannot create what happens when two people sit together and chat over a coffee. We need human interaction. And distancing impacts those who live alone far more. Loneliness, isolation, the impact on well-being, mental health, these are recognised issues we need to look at and address in our society today. We need to do something about relational poverty. We find that Adam isolates, he hides away from God. And God comes looking for him. Have you ever felt alone? Have you ever felt like that? You know, Jesus experienced that. He felt alone. There's a moment in a garden when he says he is alone, he's sitting alone in a desperate time, and he asks people, will you just come and sit with me? And the third kind of poverty, let's call it spiritual poverty. You know, I think we make a mistake in churches when we separate spiritual life from community engagement, if I call it that. I'm not sure I've seen a church website that I really like in this regard. I'm not even sure that I think we've got ours completely right yet. You know, if I'm honest, we're not a church that does projects. Neither are our projects just about meeting needs. We mustn't let that be our thinking and how we see this. This is a message of good news to the poor, and it has to bring all these things together. William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, said this: you cannot warm the hearts of people with God's love if they have empty stomachs and cold feet. There is something where we need to bring together these aspects of relational poverty, of spiritual poverty, and of this sense of aspirational poverty, this lack. You know, as a church, we go into the community in a number of ways. We have about 9 different activities we do, helping people in practical ways. A while ago, maybe beginning of this year, I met a man and we were giving him some practical support. And he asked if we had a Bible. And we didn't have one, but we said we could get one to him the following week. And he then said this: I want to know who Jesus is. We were starting an Alpha course the following week and we invited him, would he join? And he did. And the first talk was answering the question, who is Jesus? I saw him a week afterwards and I wanted to ask him how he found it. Had he understood it? How had it been? And he's just said this: I know who Jesus is. That man's part of our church family today. God's love is demonstrated and hope is restored when we connect people to God. It's actually about putting God on display. We see with Adam how he distanced himself from God. He didn't feel he could be close to God. Jesus experienced something in his life when he took our wrongdoing on himself and God turned his back on him. He said, God, why have you forsaken me? I wonder how you feel when we look at spiritual poverty. Do you sometimes have that sense that maybe God is distant from you? Maybe there's something you've had to do to earn his favour again. That's not the case. I think we find these three things all come together in one place, and it's in the cross. We find that in Jesus' death and resurrection, he brings an answer to all these things. There are things we can do for needs that we see around us. Jesus said to his followers at one point, you'll always have poor. And he was referring to a scripture that was way back in Deuteronomy. They would have known what he was talking about when he said that. And it's a scripture talking about how God is our source. That how we don't just look at meeting needs, we just look at a God who supplies needs. And we become a vessel through which that is done. It's a challenge that's given to people to be open-handed towards fellow people who are poor and needy. It's where we look at these issues of distance, of a lack, of isolation, and we come and say we want to do something about that. We want to bring God close. We want to demonstrate what God looks like in this situation. I'm intrigued by parts of the Bible that don't tell us very much and try and almost understand what's happening there. One of the things I've often said at home is one day I'm going to write a book on the growing up years of Jesus. We hear very little from him as a child to when he's a man and his ministry starts. But it says this simple sentence about him. It says that he grew tall and wise, that he was loved by God and he was loved by people. There's something about how he was as a person growing up, looking after himself. He grew tall, he grew wise, how he thought about things, how he acted. There's something there about, I think it addresses this aspirational poverty, this sense of lack. He was someone who grew tall and wise. There's something about relational poverty. He was loved by people and he was loved by God. If we're looking at faith, hope and love, there's these models here of what's been broken, what Jesus, we know all about his growing up in just those three things that were central in his life. God is a God of justice. Poverty is an injustice. God is a God who puts things right. And whatever we might be feeling today in our situation, if you're today listening to this and you're thinking there are things in my life where maybe I'm thinking there's something I don't have. There's something, God, I'm not seeing you as my provider. I'm not feeling I can depend on you. There's a God who wants to put things right today. We can trust in him and find that he is faithful and dependable. If you are feeling isolated in some way and you're finding the struggle with how things are at the moment, there is a God who never leaves us. And if you don't know God, if you've never made a decision to come to know God, you can do that too because he calls our name. Let me read this from Romans 3. The God setting things, this is in the Message, the God setting things right that we read about has become the Jesus setting things right for us. We're utterly incapable of living the glorious lives that God wills for us, so God did it for us. Out of sheer generosity, he put us in right standing with himself, a gift. He got us out of the mess we're in, and he restored us to where he always wanted us to be. And he did it by means of Jesus Christ. What's happened in the past is now current history. God sets things right. He makes it possible for us to live in his rightness. And so as we look at things of poverty, as you look at your life, as you receive some of these promises of good news that we have, I think we have something that speaks to our lives. I think we have good news to share. I think we have a gospel through Jesus that is good news to the poor.